Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this lesson, we'll be analyzing the eighth chapter for the first part of the novel Atonement, written by Ian McEwan. So, Robbie Turner happens to be sitting in his bath and he watches the grey sky from the small bungalow on the terrace grounds that is his home. He daydreams lustfully about Cecilia's wet body emerging from the fountain. At Cambridge University, his interactions with her have felt awkward. Robbie imagines that Cecilia is unsettled by the fact that Robbie is her cleaning lady's son, but Robbie is unbothered by his low social station. So, Robbie is the mirror image of unrestrained youthful masculinity. His natural vigor is not diminished at all by his low social rank, and he seems both to the reader and himself to be utterly in control of his life. Now, this moment of boyish daydreaming will stand in contrast to later parts of the work when Robbie is wrongfully deprived of freedom by authority outside of his control. The themes over have to be class and guilt. Guilt is the new theme which has been introduced over here. So let us first talk about guilt and what would it mean whenever it is going to appear. So as the book's title suggests, guilt is primary theme of atonement. After she realizes the damage that her callous, heartless testimony has brought up upon Robbie, Bryony spends a lifetime burdened by her guilt and attempting to atone for her misdeeds. Instead of going to college, she becomes a nurse, perhaps sensing a duty to help soldiers like Robbie. Yes, Robbie becomes a soldier later on, and why is that? That is going to be revealed later on. She worries, but let me tell you, it has a huge role. A huge role in that has been played by Bryony's uh, false uh, testimony against Robbie. So she worries endlessly about whether Robbie will be harmed in the line of duty, understanding that any injuries he suffers will be in some way her fault. Moreover, she is haunted by the pain she has caused her sister by slandering her beloved boyfriend and forcing the two lovers apart. What is more, as the book's conclusion reveals, Bryony has written the entire novel in an attempt to acquit Robbie and atone for her life. But is that possible? That is a question for the audience or the readers to decide or answer upon. Since McEwan casts guilt as such a powerful and universal human sentiment, it is worth noting that Robbie's wartime experience or often forces him to skip the feelings of guilt for the people he has not saved, skip the feelings of guilt for the dead he has not buried, even though he realizes later on that he could not have saved everyone. But why he's forcing the character of Robbie to skip the feelings of guilt? Only in the interest of his preservation. It is shown that yani ke Robbie, is skipping the feelings of guilt in an interest of self-preserving himself. In this way, the author shows that Robbie has been somewhat dehumanized as, what should we say, dehumanized largely by factors outside of his control. A portion of his capacity for guilt seems to have been transferred to the person who caused his misfortune. Okay, so when Robbie has been portrayed as being dehumanized because of the consequence of Bridie's childish misconduct, so because Robbie's own fate has been determined largely by the factors outside of his control, a portion of his capacity for guilt seems to have been transferred to the person who actually caused his misfortune, who happens to be Bryony. So it is shown through the author to the writer that's in some way or another, Bryony is burdened with some extra guilt, the guilt which is not found in Robbie. So some part of Robbie's guilt has been given to Bryony. Similarly, Lola actually ends up marrying the person who actually raped her, who is Paul Marshall. And the implication is that in doing so, these two characters are both able to hide or escape their guilt in allowing Robbie to be falsely accused. And that Paul is able to further hide his own rape of Lola in exchange for making Lola, the daughter of a divorcee, wealthy by marrying her. So, wherever we will find the theme of guilt, it would have the same limitations and same ideas. Okay, now Robbie rises from his bath and thinks more about his encounter with Cecilia by the fountain. He worries about the anger she must feel towards him, but fantasizes that she will let her fury yield to romantic desire. He reconsiders perhaps Cecilia's goal was to humiliate him or even to seduce him. So Robbie's indecision shows that even from an insider's perspective, the encounter at the fountain was hard to interpret. यानी कि the people were the characters who were involved in that encounter, it was difficult for them to interpret the feelings and what was actually happening. So how could Bryony, who was looking at that moment from way behind, could have interpreted the real situation? So this suggests that Bryony's attempt to decipher that moment, it was based on even less knowledge of the event and of the world as compared to the characters involved in it. It will be the Bryony's attempt to decipher it will be seriously mistaken, and it happens to be the first step of building up that story or perspective in Bryony's mind, leading to the false testimony. The themes again happen to be perspective because of the perspective of Bryony, and the lost innocence because of her innocence, which is going to be completely lost after her false testimony. Okay, now Robbie sits before his typewriter, and I mean, again, that typewriter is a gift from Jack Tellis, and he surveys the school books scattered across his desk. He gazes at a photo of his parents, Grace and Ernest, as newlyweds, and Ernest's distance in that photo from his wife, it foreshadows an incident 7 years later when he quits his job at the Telly's as the Telly's gardener and abandons his family without even warning them. Robbie's eyes then shift to his admission package for medical school and Jack Tallis's written promise to help pay his tuition. So the contrast this scene sets up illustrates just how much of a father figure Jack Tallis is to Robbie as compared to his real father. But at the same time, it establishes that no matter what Robbie's individual capabilities may be, as a lower class man who wants to be a doctor, he is completely dependent on teleseries for their sponsorship. So this happens to be the analysis of this, and the theme of this analysis would be class. Okay, now after some more contemplation, Robbie begins to type an apology letter to Cecilia, but he is unsure of what tone to use in that letter. He revises for some time and suddenly writes a vivid description of his sexual fantasies, only for himself. His anatomy book sits beside him, open to a diagram of the vulva. He ruins this draft of the letter, so he rewrites it in handwriting now. this time with the sexual language eliminated. So, like Briney's stories, Robbie's writing lets him create a universe in which he can manifest his desires and can make them real. Though rather than assessing the perception of others by writing, Robbie simply wants to assess to Cecilia's body. He does not want to change the perception of others by his writing, but he only wants to fantasize upon Cecilia's body through his writing. But both of them are using their writing. Okay, the themes would be perspective and stories and literature. Now, Robbie begins to get dressed in his suit for dinner and he starts to speak with his mother Grace. Grace was taken on as the Taliesin as the cleaning lady after Ernest abandoned her because Jack Tallis could not bear to turn her and her 6-year-old child Robbie away. Grace gained favor from the Taliesis and Robbie was soon socialized with other young children. A few years later, Grace's help with Bryony's birth earned her ownership of the bungalow. So the Turner's story illustrates their persistence and merit, as well as the extraordinary generosity of Jack Tallis. It is doubtless that this upbringing and his confidence in Jack Tallis's care for him and his status with the family has made him confident in his own abilities rather than feeling limited by his social station. So, because of this confidence and this persistence by the Turners in the life of Robbie, it has made him a confident person, okay, who believes in his own abilities, and because of that, he does not feel in any way limited to his social class because of the confidence he has, because of the future aspirations he has for becoming a doctor and becoming an independent person. The theme again would be class over here. Okay, after some small talk with his mother, Robbie places his letter to Cecilia in an envelope and bounds out the door, headed to the main house for dinner. He is fearful and excited to see Cecilia, but is convinced that he is in love with her, and his bright academic future makes him feel optimistic. He enjoys the freedom that he feels and longs to begin the next chapters of his life. This moment in which Robbie is full of unrestrained potential and free to do as he pleases is meant to stand in sharp contrast to later moments in the work. Later on, Robbie will find his liberties infringed by the judiciary and the military, as well as by the fact that the upper class naturally suspects the lower class, and this moment will be impossible to bring Robbie back to his confident lifestyle, to bring back to his confidence understanding of life and his emotions and his actions. It would be impossible to recreate after what is going to happen because of the social class. The themes would be the perspective, the lost innocence, and a new theme, which is the unchangeable past. So, this happens to be the new theme which is being introduced over here. So, let us first talk about this theme so that we understand whenever it is introduced later on in the novel. So the most important plot developments in the work, they stem from actions or experiences that can never be erased or countered. Once Bryony testifies against Robbie, she takes on a responsibility for Robbie's fate that she will never be able to shed, and she loses an innocence that she will never be able to regain. No matter what she does to atone for her misdeed, she will not be able to replace the future. Love with Cecilia being a doctor that she has stolen from Robbie's life. So, no matter what she does to atone for her misdeed, she will not be able to replace the future that she has stolen from Robbie's life. And one future could have been the love with this Cecilia, and it could have been Robbie being a doctor. Both these futures have been replaced, and actually, Briny happens to be the person who has stolen these futures away from Cecilia and Robbie. So, not surprisingly, Briny's accusation leaves a permanent mark on Robbie too. As a consequence of his imprisonment, he is unable to continue his prestigious education and must instead enlist in the military. The violence and suffering that Robbie witnesses in the war traumatizes him and permanently alters his temperament, permanently alters his confidence and his personality. Similarly, after Bryony works her first shift in the hospital caring for seriously wounded soldiers, she feels as though she has crossed into a new stage of maturity and worldliness from which she can never return. This theme of irretrievability interconnects interestingly with the novel's theme of individual perspective. In many ways, the most irrevocable changes in the novel come when characters lose the ability to perceive their realities in a certain way. For example, as an aging Bryony reflects on her past, she no longer sees the world with the tragically narcissistic perspective she used to hold as a child. And in this way, her new perspective irretrievably reshapes the reality of her life. In the next part of this chapter, on his way to the house, Robbie spots Bryony standing alone in the driveway. He decides that it may be a good idea to send Bryony ahead with his letter to Cecilia in case Emily see him passing Cecilia a note and disapprove, or Cecilia reject his contact entirely. He asks Bryony to deliver the letter to Cecilia, and she runs away with the envelope in hand. Suddenly, Robbie realizes that he has placed the wrong letter in the envelope. Instead of sending the non sexual second draft, he has enclosed the vulgar type letter. He writes, he immediately tries to pursue Bryony, but cannot catch up with her. She has already entered the house and closed the door. So Robbie's writings, when introduced to the world, begin to shift and shape the narrative in a way that is beyond his control. This is very much similar to the way Bryony finds herself unable to control the performance and reception of first her play, and then more destructively how the narratively she creates in her mind regarding Cecilia and Robbie's relationship and her own position as a hero in that story. She begins to assume power and influence beyond what she anticipated. The themes of this part happens to be the story and literature, lost innocence, and the unchangeable past. With this, we're going to end this lesson. I hope you have understood. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.